Hi, welcome back to Radio Free Gastonia, the internet's #1 choice for emergency history content. Today we're going to be talking about the idea of Reagan and the new right. You'll see this as being kind of a sequel episode to our earlier discussions about the New Deal and FDR and the Great Depression in the 1930s, because we talked about that as a period where there was a big ideological shift in the way people thought about the nature of a fair society, what the relationship between the people and the government should be, what the government's role in the economy should be, how the economy should be structured. Changes that were pretty lasting and you could say are still with us in some ways today, even though it's 90 years later. What happened in the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan may not be quite on the same level of magnitude as that, but it is very significant because it is a change in the ideological parameters of American politics and culture. So we're going to talk about how that came about. People talk about it as the Reagan Revolution. Well, revolutions tend to seem like they happen all at once, like the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s, or the Russian Revolution in the 19-teens, or the American Revolution in the 1770s, as if, oh my God, everything's just changing all at once, all at the same time. Where did that come from? But usually there's lots of reasons that build up over time for that. In the same way that like cracks in a dam or a glacier build up over time and add up, and then all of a sudden the whole thing collapses or falls apart, and you're like, well, where did that come from? So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. How did this Reagan ideological revolution in the 1980s come about? So the theme of today's episode is, this is definitely either morning or midnight, Reagan's America. So we have to start our story back in the 1940s, when a lot of the ideas that lead up to Reagan's ascension really begin to be developed. Now, if we look at the 1950s, there is a fellow named Lionel Trilling. That's him right now. He was a literary critic, professor at Columbia and Harvard. Definitely does not look like somebody who's about to get his ass kicked. And here is what he had to say about conservatism and the right wing. He said, in the United States at this time, liberalism is not only the dominant, but even the sole intellectual tradition. For it is the plain fact that nowadays there are no conservative or reactionary ideas in general circulation. This does not mean, of course, that there is no impulse to conservatism or to reaction. Such impulses are certainly very strong, perhaps even stronger than most of us know. Foreshadowing, spoiler alert. But the conservative impulse and the reactionary impulse do not, with some isolated and some ecclesiastical exceptions, express themselves in ideas, but only in action or in irritable mental gestures which seek to resemble ideas. Lionel Trilling, 1950, esteemed college professor. Now, you might recall that this is kind of similar to what we talked about with the 1964 election, when LBJ, the Democrat, won this big landslide victory, and a lot of commentators were saying conservatism is over, the Republican Party is done, it's run over by a steamroller. Those ideas are dead. As Trilling put it, these are just irritable mental gestures which seek to resemble ideas. That's what conservatism is. Now, as you can guess from the way I'm going with the story, that's not exactly how things turned out. In fact, there was a conservative, or rather to say there were multiple intellectual conservative traditions at this time that Trilling and others just didn't recognize because they were so out of fashion in the age of the welfare state, the New Deal, the Depression, when it seemed like obviously the government should intervene to help people in these times of extreme crisis. Conservatism as an ideology did not seem very like with the times. So we have to look at where these ideas came from and how they changed. All right. So we talk about, for instance, Friedrich Hayek. So this book came out in 1944. It was actually pretty successful at the time. The Road to Serfdom. Super catchy title. We might look at the New Deal welfare state, which provided Social Security and these other benefits to the population, and say, wow, that's helping people, that's cool. But Hayek saw it as the beginning of the road to serfdom. It was a form of slavery. He made the point that New Deal liberalism and social democracy, socialism in Europe, were just variants on the same thing as Stalinism in the Soviet Union, the sort of authoritarian communism of Russia and the Soviet Union, or also Nazism and fascism. Nazism meaning National Socialism. Most scholars then and honestly today see National Socialism, Nazism, as being a version of right-wing, ultra-conservative politics. But Hayek was coming along and saying, no, actually Nazism and communism are all different forms of authoritarianism where the government becomes too powerful. And so he was saying, we give up little bits of liberty all the time until every time the government taxes us, gives us a new benefit, it becomes bigger and stronger, and it takes more away from us. So Hayek became a big influence on what we now think of as libertarianism, but he was basically advocating the idea of the free market. Like people, going back to freedom of contract, people should just be able to do in the free marketplace, exchange, buy, truck, and barter, without the government, laws, big government, centralized planning getting in the way. So he basically saw communism and fascism as being two ends of the spectrum of authoritarian government that takes over people's lives. Now, this was not the dominant view at the time, because a lot of people did like the idea of government intervention for social welfare. But there were many people who did like Hayek's point of view. Now, that's just Hayek. So there's another branch of this, and I would associate this with a fellow named Richard Weaver. And he made this point that ideas have consequences. And he was a philosophy professor, a lit scholar at the University of Chicago, and he favored this sort of, he was more of a traditionalist. He wasn't saying, oh, well, we should let the free market just do whatever it wants. We should have this totally uncontrolled, unregulated society. Weaver was very different. He was saying, actually, like the old South, like the way things used to be in older societies where there was an upper class, a middle class, a lower class, maybe where there were even masters and slaves, the social betters and the social lowers, like, that's natural. That's the way things should be. That's, whether you like it or not, that's the way human society works. People like Weaver felt like the impulses of liberalism and socialism and communism at the time were trying to introduce an unnatural leveling of everyone, this egalitarianism that everybody is exactly the same, which is essentially the principle of classical liberalism. Everybody is the same, everybody has the same rights, everybody can freely compete with everyone else. Weaver and a few of his other intellectual compatriots in this time period really felt like that was misguided. And so they were advocating for a more hierarchical, organic, traditional, slow-moving society that wasn't going for progress and the new thing all the time. That actually did embrace the idea that there should be people on the top and people on the bottom, and that's just the way it is. This was also not considered a super popular idea in the 40s or 50s when really the idea of liberal democracy had won the war in World War II. This idea of equality, individualism, egalitarianism, competition. So he was seen as being outside the norm too. Not a total crank, but somebody who's outside the norm. So Weaver said ideas have consequences, as we're going to find out. That's true. So you've got these two kind of sides. You've got people who are Hayek, which is like free market everything. People like Weaver who say basically we need to go back to the old South before the Civil War. or feudalism or something, because that's organic and natural and true to human nature. These things seem completely different. They might be both considered right-wing or conservative in some sense, but not really at the time. They were very distinct ideas that were very far apart. It remained for this other person named William F. Buckley to come along. And that's Buckley right there. Interesting fellow. He's sort of an aristocrat from Connecticut. And he started this magazine called National Review in the 50s. Now, Buckley's key insight was that liberalism, or left-wing liberalism as a philosophy, was dominant at the time in the 1940s and 1950s in the United States. The conservative movement was fractured among sort of like very free market people who were very traditionalist and religious, and people who were very like military oriented and in favor of a super hawkish, strong foreign policy. And these three camps didn't seem like they really had that much to do with each other. Buckley realized I could bring them all together under the idea of anti-communism, because the one thing that all three of those groups really don't like is communism. And this also happens to be the Cold War, so why not? This is, the perfect time to fuse these different areas together, these different political factions together under one new conservative movement. And his magazine, the National Review, along with some other major publications, really starts to have a major impact on the political discussion in the US starting in the 50s. Keep in mind, Buckley's point of view, he was an elitist. He believed that, his National Review really advocated some somewhat racist points of view, especially about desegregation and things like that, about the abilities of African Americans, the innate, racial differences. But this is all a part of the idea that, there are some people who are better than others, right? This is not necessarily a super popular view at the time, so he has to find a way to communicate this to people. And so, one of Buckley's biggest challenges is to figure out how to get the really weird people out of the right. And this is embodied by what was called the John Birch Society. These were people who were really kind of nuts. They were definitely anti-communist, but they were also anti-United Nations. They thought the UN was trying to take over the world and start a dictatorship. They were anti-civil rights for sure, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-black, and had lots of very weird conspiracy theories. They were anti-Semitic. And Buckley was smart enough to realize, we got to get these people out of the club. So he pushed out the people who were part of the Birch Society and said, you wacko nut jobs have to just go. We are going to create a new respectable intellectual conservatism out of this combination of libertarianism, traditionalism, and a strong anti-communist military philosophy or ideology. So, the guy who comes along and kind of embodies a lot of this is Ronald Reagan. We've talked about him before. He had been an actor. He had been the head of the Screen Actors Guild, which is a union, ironically, based on what happens later. Reagan campaigns against Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. He becomes sort of a conservative icon, conservative activist. And he becomes governor of California in 1966, or is elected, rather. This is a time when on the college campuses there was beginning to be, a lot of protest and revolt against the Vietnam War. This was a time when there had been a fair housing law passed in California, which a lot of people didn't like because it said you couldn't racially discriminate in who you sold or rented your property to, and a strong anti-welfare sentiment. So Reagan becomes governor on the back of these middle-class suburban frustrations, anxieties, and angers about the welfare state and hippies and social change, social liberalism. Ironically, interestingly enough, Reagan actually, as governor, does some things that are kind of noteworthy in terms of a liberal point of view. Reagan signed a measure legalizing abortion, or many abortions, in 1967. He signed the first no-fault divorce law in the country in 1969. Abortion, you understand what that means. No-fault divorce was a big thing, especially for feminists, because it allowed people to get out of really horrible abusive marriages, which had been very difficult prior to that. These would seem to be considered very liberal things. But for the most part, Reagan was a conservative icon. And his governorship of California paved the way for him running for president. He runs for president in 1976, unsuccessfully tries to get the nomination away from the Republican incumbent Gerald Ford. But he does become the nominee in 1980 when, as we've discussed, Jimmy Carter is having a lot of problems. Reagan really capitalizes on the sense that there is a crisis in the country, a sense of a crisis of confidence, weakening of institutions, that people don't respect the U.S. militarily, economically, politically, that people are being immoral and society is falling apart, the economy is bad, and Carter seems to be unable to do anything about it. So Reagan really takes advantage of that. So Reagan wins in a landslide. You've got the election of 1980, as you can see. The red part is Reagan. Carter managed to win a few states, but it is a huge, Reagan walks away with the victory. And this is the beginning of a huge change in American politics. So Reagan is promising morning in America. He's saying, we're going to bring America back. It's going to be powerful. It's going to be strong again. We're going to be moral again. We're going to get rid of all this red tape and bureaucracy and government regulation that's suffocating the economy. We're going to bring back the economy by letting business do its thing. And we're also going to have this idea of Reaganomics. Now, Reagan's ideas are not that hard to explain. We're going to cut taxes a lot because we have this idea that if you cut taxes, then people, especially rich people, will have lots of money to spend and invest. This is what people call trickle-down economics. So you can see that the money, if you give rich people money, they'll invest it, and then they'll start businesses and create jobs, and the benefits of that will trickle down to the other parts of the population. So Reaganomics, tax cuts, big tax cuts, that really changed the nature of the U.S. political economy. Deregulation, so we're going to get rid of a lot of these rules and regulations that are put on businesses to regulate the economy. We're going to increase military spending massively to make the country strong again, especially against the Soviet Union and the communists. And so this is kind of the idea of Reagan and his philosophy. There's also this idea of the Laffer Curve, which, Arthur Laffer is an economist who introduced this idea. You need to look at this chart here as I explain it. Now, what Laffer said is that if we have very high taxes, say we had a 100% tax rate, then people would not want to work very much, right? What's the point of going out to work if the government's going to take 100% of my money? So I won't even bother. Now, if they take 75% of my money, I might work a little bit, but not much because the government's still taking most of my money. Now, if they take 50% of my money, I'd probably work quite a bit, but they're still taking a lot. So Laffer argued that, if the government is taking so much money in taxes, then people will find a way to cheat. Or they will either not work or they'll find a way to cheat to disguise their wages. So the government actually ends up taking in less money once it has a very high tax rate, according to Laffer. I don't know if this is necessarily true, but this is what Laffer said. So there's sort of a happy medium point along the way where you could cut taxes, and actually get the most tax revenue. And if you cut them too much, then you're not getting a lot of tax revenue at all. So basically, Laffer's argument is that we need to cut taxes because then people will cut taxes and actually get more revenue. That was Laffer's idea. Some people call it Lafferable, but this was a very influential idea. This part of the idea of Reaganomics. So Reagan comes in and introduces this plan. The economy does get better, Inflation goes down, unemployment goes down, the economy begins to expand, there's more investment in the economy. So you could say, looking at these policies and say they're actually working. The country comes out of a really rough depression, like not depression, but a very deep recession in the early 80s. And by the end of Reagan's first term, the economy's really come back, and so he wins a huge re-election. Because it seems like what Reagan's proposing is actually working, at least for some people. Now, there are other social trends that are going on at the same time. There's the idea of the Sun Belt. So look at this. Like, the Sun Belt is the whole part of the country that goes all the way from sort of Virginia and the old Confederacy, the old southeastern states, Georgia, etc., all the way through Texas over to California. The Sun Belt, the warm, sunny parts of the country. There was a huge population growth in this time period from 1950 to 1990 in those states. People were leaving Detroit, Boston, New York, Buffalo, etc., in the northern states and going to the warmer southern states. Is that because they like warm weather? Yes, partly. Air conditioning was invented. But it was also the fact that those southern states and those southwestern states had fewer regulations, lower taxes, fewer unions. So businesses were moving there because it was easier to make money than in the northern states that had lots of unions and laws and regulations, safety protections for workers and consumers and so forth, and higher taxes. So the Sun Belt grows and grows and grows, but that causes a lot of agony for all these people up here, especially in upstate New York, Michigan, New Jersey, Ohio, the old industrial states. That causes a lot of problems. We're going to talk about that some more. At the same time, that the economy maybe in the early 80s is improving, like it's getting, there's higher levels of employment and investment, lower levels of inflation. You do see from the late 70s onward, really from the early 70s, this chart doesn't show it, that the inequality between the upper income brackets and everybody else really grows and grows and grows. So, you get to a point where the upper, 1% or 5% or 10% has vastly greater wealth than the sort of the quintiles or sectors in the middle, like the middle class or the working class or the poor or the working poor. You can see that the people at the lower bottom just basically stay the same, whereas these people have a much greater growth of wealth. How that comes about is a result of a lot of different factors. Some of those have to do with automation and deindustrialization. You saw in that Sunbelt map that a lot of those old industrial areas in New Jersey, New York, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin had, their economies had declined. So those jobs were either going to the Sunbelt or they were going overseas to other countries, or they were being automated by, robots and computers. So, that's one reason why people have less money, the working class, the middle class. There is the decline of unions, which comes along with the changes I just described. Unions usually get people better wages and better health care and benefits. And there are these tax changes where the taxes on the upper incomes are decreased dramatically as part of Reagan's program. So, deindustrialization, the movement to the Sun Belt, deregulation, and the growth of economic inequality. At the same time as that is the urban crisis. We've been talking about this a bit. This really, the Pruitt-Igoe myth, starts us on this journey. Remember we talked about how all the industry left St. Louis, all the middle class consumers and residents moved to the suburbs, especially white suburbanites, middle class people, and the economies, the tax bases of the cities just went down the tubes. At the same time, ironically, a huge number of African Americans from mostly the South moved to the northern and midwestern cities seeking industrial jobs right before that whole urban industrial economy fell apart. So you have many African American residents and other people of color in the big cities of the North and the Midwest, and also the West Coast, LA, and so forth, that are left behind when basically all public services fall apart because there's no tax base or tax revenue, and there's no jobs because the factories and industrialization have moved away, and they're kind of trapped. Then there's my good friend Mr. Crack, who shows up in the early to mid 80s and is a highly addictive, relatively cheap, and destructive drug that sweeps through these urban communities at their most vulnerable point. And so there is just chaos, disaster. If you guys are older, maybe you remember this, maybe your parents remember this. It was a very violent and difficult time for people in all of America's cities because there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of drug addiction, there's a lot of crime, but there's also the conditions of poverty that made it almost impossible to thrive and survive in the inner cities of especially the older industrial cities like New York, Detroit, LA. So this, all these things are coming together. The idea that like everything has gotten better. Reagan said it's morning in America. And in some ways, especially if you're a middle-class suburbanite, things have gotten pretty good. Like inflation has gone down, the economy's growing. If you invest in the stock market, that's growing. Maybe things are pretty good. Like compared to the 70s, that's a lot better. In the same way that like the 50s were kind of like not good in some ways. But if you grew up in the Depression or World War II, you're like, this is great in the 1950s. But the economy and the society of America in the 1980s really left behind lots of people in the inner cities, in communities of color, and in older industrial communities throughout what we call the Rust Belt, like the older industrial parts of the country. So I wanted you guys to look at the song The River by Bruce Springsteen, and the song Black Steel and the Hour of Chaos by Public Enemy. Bruce Springsteen's song came out in 1980 on his album The River, and this really tells the story of the people in like Jersey who used to work in the factories, who used to have, people who are high school educated, working class jobs, union. He says in the song, I come from down in the valley where mister, when you're young, they bring you up to do like your daddy done. Me and Mary, we met in high school when she was just 17. We'd ride out of this valley down to where the fields were green. Then I got Mary pregnant, and man, that was all she wrote. And for my 19th birthday, I got a union card and a wedding coat. We went down to the courthouse, and the judge put it all to rest. No wedding day smiles, no walk down the aisle, no flowers, no wedding dress. So we see here that this is a guy, he's going to go work in the same place where his dad worked. He's going to join the union as soon as he knocks up his girlfriend, they get married. He's going to live the working class life, the union life that had existed before. But he finds out, I got a job working construction for the Johnstown Company. But lately there ain't been much work on account of the economy. Now all of them things that seem so important, well, mister, they just vanished right into the air. Now I just act like I don't remember. Mary acts like she don't care. So there's a deep sense of loss and disappointment. Like the economy is bad for a working class white man in New Jersey. The unions aren't there anymore. The jobs aren't there anymore. And I just have diminished hopes and dreams. Me and my wife, like, life sucks, but we're just getting through it and pretending that we never had any hopes or dreams or aspirations. That's Bruce Springsteen's point of view on the changing economy and culture in 1980. If you look at Public Enemy, Black Steel and the Hour of Chaos, this is a story of a black man who is in prison and his desire to escape and violently resist his incarceration. And he begins the song by saying, I got a letter from the government the other day. I opened it and read it. It said they were suckers. They wanted me for their army or whatever. Picture me giving a damn. I said never. Here's a land that never gave a damn about a brother like me and myself because they never did. I wasn't with it, but just that very minute it occurred to me the suckers had authority. So Chuck D, who's the the lyricist on this song, is talking about like he's in prison, or the character's in prison, and he gets a letter from the government asking him to join the army, which is interesting. And he's like, well, A, I'm in prison, and I didn't deserve to be here, and this is the oppressive system. So he says, I'm looking for the steel. He's looking for a gun to get out of this situation. Cold sweating as I dwell in my cell. How long has it been? They got me sitting in a state pen. I gotta get out, but that thought was thought before. I contemplated a plan on the cell floor. I'm not a fugitive on the run, but a brother like me begun to be another one, public enemy serving time. They drew the line, y'all, to criticize me for some crime. So he's talking about the age of mass incarceration, the war on drugs that threw so many people of color, especially black men, in prison, especially in the 80s and 90s. So people were just being thrown in prison left and right with extremely long prison sentences for having, relatively small amounts of drugs. So Chuck D is saying, look, I'm trapped in the system. So he says a very interesting thing. He says, nevertheless, they could not understand that I'm a black man and I could never be a veteran. On the street, the situation's unreal. I got a raw deal, so I'm looking for the steal. Now, what he's saying here is interesting because it's literally not true. I mean, I'm a black man and I can never be a veteran. We all know lots of black men served in the armed forces and were veterans. So what is Chuck D trying to get at here? He's trying to make a point, which is to say I could never be a veteran. I could never fight for this country because this country treats me like a slave. They got me rotting in the time that I'm serving, telling you what happened the same time they're throwing 4 of us packed in a cell like slaves. Oh well, the same motherfucker got us living in this hell. You have to realize what it's a form of slavery organized under a swarm of devils. He's saying mass incarceration is a form of slavery, so how on earth could he fight for that country? So think about these two different sides of the Reagan era. Bruce Springsteen in 1980, talking about the old white working class that were facing diminished opportunities. His famous song, Born in the USA, is about a guy who goes and fights in Vietnam and comes back and can't get a job. So that guy is a white man who went and fought, who is a veteran, and he's screwed over. Chuck D is in prison in 1988 in the album It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, and he's saying, I could never be a veteran. So you see, despite the fact that the economy seems to be getting better for some people, and the rich are definitely getting much richer, under the policies of Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party, there are a lot of other people, working class people, white and black and otherwise, who really feel like they're being left behind, that things are getting much worse, whether it's the crime and violence of the crack era and the drug war and mass incarceration, or just the destruction of industrial communities throughout the country, especially outside of the Sun Belt. So this is why I would say this is either morning or midnight. Like Reagan's whole theme was, it's morning in America. Things have gotten better. I brought America back from the brink. We're strong, we're happy, we're prosperous again. People like Bruce Springsteen and Chuck D would say, no, we're not. But the rating ethos of the era was, of course, what Gordon Gekko, who was a character in a movie called Wall Street, directed by Oliver Stone, who's a big, corporate guy. Gordon Gekko said, greed is good. Greed works. Like that, this movie was satirical, so it was kind of making fun of this character, but he was still saying, look, greed is good, greed works, greed clarifies. We should let the free market do whatever it wants, and rich people will create prosperity and wealth for the rest of us. That is sort of the idea of the age. When you look at the films Paris is Burning, you see that a lot of the characters in that, who are the most marginalized, dispossessed people, actually really aspired to the ideals of materialism and capitalism that people like Gordon Gekko were actually espousing. So that's the spirit of the age. The 1980s are a time when the idea of the free market and the prerogatives of big business really come back in a big way. But there's still a significant amount of misery and frustration out there in the country, in the heartland, in the inner cities, and in the hour of chaos. So, as we move forward, we're going to talk about the sort of ideological path of the country in the 1980s and into the 1990s, when we see the era of Bill Clinton, the internet, and the end of welfare as we know it. So, stay tuned. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.